time for our next session. Please welcome now onto the stage Sophie Lambin, founder and CEO of Kite Insights, and the panelists for this session, No Climate Justice Without Gender Justice. Please welcome them now onto the stage.
Welcome. Thank you, everyone. We thought we'll give you a really light topic before lunch. So thank you for hanging in there. We're going to have another speaker joining us virtually, so I hope she will join us in a minute. But a little bit of scene setting from me before we start. Clearly, climate justice has become a hot topic, no pun intended. International institutions, climate scientists, and leading policy think tanks are increasingly recognizing that efforts to address climate change can only be successful if we address injustice and inequalities in tandem. While this is increasingly talked about, I don't think it's necessarily very well understood. What does climate justice actually look like in reality, and what do we mean by gender justice in the context of climate change? That is really the question that we're going to be grappling with today before lunch. You heard Sandrine Dixon de Clèves yesterday and Mary Robinson, who really set it up very well for us. And I would like to bring this international initiative to your attention, Earth for All, which really is a groundbreaking study just in the lead up to COP27 with the same very important message. Their finding highlighted that full gender equity and large-scale reduction in global inequality are essential if we are to achieve full economic system change and reach a world in which society thrives within planetary boundaries. The rationale for this is that if climate and inequality are addressed as a whole, the system will trigger a positive tipping point of positive feedback loops, and there are a lot of potential of negative tipping point out there, and that positive feedback loop can actually lead us to a pathway towards a giant leap for humanity, as they call it. By failing to do so, we risk exacerbating global instabilities and undermining resilience of key stakeholders and communities. We are actually, in blunt terms, going towards chaos. So justice, gender equality, gender justice are critical to our ability to deliver a safe world for us all. So for the sake of this session, I will define how the Women's Forum has referred to as climate justice as ensuring the impact of climate change as well as the cost and impact of climate mitigation and adaptation efforts are distributed fairly. Climate justice ultimately means looking at the climate crisis through a human rights lens with a focus on equity. Again, you heard Mary Robinson yesterday talking about climate change being fundamentally unequal and unjust in how it impacts women, and particularly women of color, young people, which is referred to as intergenerational justice, specific region of the world. We know that the South have contributed to very little to global emission and are most impacted in terms of physical vulnerabilities. Workers, think about fossil fuel workers, and finally nature. So there is a lot of injustice embedded into climate change. So with that setup, I was going to give you an example, but I think we should get on with the conversation, and I would love to introduce my speakers that are joining me today. So to my left, Young-Tae Kim, who is the Secretary General of International Transport Forum. Welcome, Young-Tae. Florence Tondu-Mélique, CEO of Zurich, France, and proudly, I think the Women's Forum can say, a 2016 Rising Talent. Welcome, Florence. And rejoining us remotely, Farhana Yamin, an environmental lawyer, honorary fellow at Somerville College, and a climate activist who famously glued herself to the Shell building. Welcome, Farhana.
Hello. Hello.
And I just want to say that Farhana is coming back from COP27 feeling quite sick, so very kindly joined us remotely here instead of joining us in person. So I would like to do a very quick lightning round, asking each of you, what does climate justice means to you in the context of your work? And maybe, Farhana, I'll start with you. What does climate justice means to you in a few words?
It means putting people first instead of, I think, economic growth, the profits of existing industries. It means looking first and foremost at the existing inequalities that have been built into the system and that are now going to be made worse by climate change. So for me, climate justice, it starts with that recognition that not everyone is equal already, and that some of those inequalities came from a set of business practices, a way of running the economy, our relationships with nature that are frankly now tipping us over the edge on a planetary basis. So first and foremost, let's look at the sources of those inequalities, and let's start then to look at how climate makes them worse and how we can address them better together.
Wonderful, thank you, Farhana. And Florence, if I go to you, what does it mean to you?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Well, for us as an insurer, it's first and foremost about climate risk and looking at that risk from the human rights lens, as you have mentioned, and considering what we call intersectionalities with other parameters, which are geopolitical, geographical, which are social, which are economic, which are racial, gender diversity, but also intergenerational. What we see, and that was one of the key learnings from the Yellow Vest protest in France, is that we won't achieve climate transition if we don't address climate justice. The difficulty with climate justice is that it's intercorrelated with very deep, very structural issues, creating that risk multiplier effect we are going to discuss in a minute about.
Well said, thank you, Florence. And Young-tae?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Basically, ITF is an intergovernmental body having 64 member countries, and we deal with this question together with the question of digitalization and universal access, connectivity, and so on in the mobility sector, knowing that 25% of the CO2 comes from the transport sector. Basically, we cannot really ignore this question. But we also have to know that there is no boundary in the sky or no boundary in the climate area. So basically, when we talk about climate justice, I would like to define that as something as follows. So everyone can equally participate in this question, in this discussion to solve the problem. And also everyone should get equal benefits from this solution.
Great. So it's both sides of the coin, isn't it? Is recognize the disproportionate, unequal impact, but ensure equal participation in the solutions, I think, which is where your point is going to come to life later. Now, the second question is then, how does gender fit in this framing? What is the part that gender has to play, in your view, in contributing to climate justice? And Farhana, again, in a few words, coming to you first.
Well, existing society, not everyone does everything equally. There are roles in the economy, in the caring sector that are gendered, where women, for example, are disproportionately doing some jobs and not others. And in general, the jobs that women do are underpaid, under-recognized, undervalued. And the struggle for the last few hundred years has to try and get equality in terms of value and worth, not just in the workplace, but a huge amount of work that is done by women in the caring sectors, looking after children, looking after the elderly, looking after nature, looking after their communities, is not valued at all by the economy. So gender equality, I think, means first and foremost giving everyone an equal opportunity to play all of the diverse roles well. I'm of the view that we should increasingly do away with gender altogether, that men and women and everyone in between should have an equal opportunity to play all of the different roles that we have in life. But for now, we know that those who are defined as women by society, tend to get lower recognition, lower pay, lower status, and still have many, many barriers in the way of career progression in terms of the choices that they have. So gender equality, if we can't get to gender equality, we are so far away from creating the kind of more compassionate, caring, and frankly, nature-based society, human rights-based society, if we leave out half of the planet from the equation altogether.
Thank you, Farhana. And also there's a point that women are, in so many ways, early adopters of solutions, right? And they need to be given the space and the opportunity to contribute as actively as they can to those solutions. But Florence, if I go to you, then where does gender fit into this equation in your view?
Well, what we are seeing is that if you're taking climate risk and women have a disproportionate exposure to that risk. Why is that? And I'm going to give you 3 examples of those correlations which I've mentioned. When a natural catastrophe happens, if you're a woman, you have 14 more times likelihood of dying from that natural catastrophe. And if you're not one of those fatal casualties, then you would represent more than 80% of the migration flows as a result, where, by the way, you will be exposed to other forms of violence. The second observation we are making as an insurer in terms of those correlations is the correlation between that exposure and the fact that women are much more dependent on biodiversity and biodiversity loss and natural resources. Why is that? In the world, women produce 50 to 80% of the crops. They are the primary responsible for food security, but also supply of water and supply of energy. In 8 out of 10 households where those households don't have access to water, women are in charge of water collection. So there is a correlation here as well. And the last factor is the correlation between climate risk and social and economic inequalities. This has just been mentioned, but women tend to be overrepresented in underpaid or unpaid jobs. They are also representing 70% of the 1.3 billion people in poverty. They also are much more discriminated from an education point of view, and especially when confronted with extreme weather events, then probably they are the first one to forego education and their work. So there are multiple elements which are creating that higher exposures for women.
And if I do a follow-up question to you on this, Florence, there's also multiple evidence, as I was just alluding to, that women are at the forefront of deploying solutions, adopting climate-smart practices, for example, in the way they manage the land. Is that something that you are also looking into, not just the risk, but the opportunity of empowering women?
Absolutely, and this is where there is an opportunity. We may discuss that later, but we see a first opportunity in women representation in governance body and decision-making body. But you're right, at the solution level, which is a very difficult topic because it's very complex. Women are so in tune with their environment that probably they are the best one to develop those solutions. The issue we are seeing today is that for a number of reasons, in particular because they are underrepresented in technical jobs and education, today, they take less part than we want to into shaping those solutions.
And we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that. So, looking at sort of the transport context, Yongtae, I'd love to hear from you the link that you see between gender justice and climate justice.
I would like to put, I would say, 3 variable equation first. So we have now climate question, and secondly we have now mobility, transport question, and we also have gender questions. So how can we make a good combination to reach an optimal point in our society is a real challenge and a really important question. So as I mentioned already, transport sector occupies 25% of the CO2 emissions. But look at the transport sector. So in our sector, it's quite the male-dominated aspect that really have a great influence on our policymakers and also on our realities. So when we really try to decarbonize our societies, we also focus on decarbonizing transport, but in the transport sector, basically all the infrastructure is designed by men. I mean, not all, but in many countries, especially in developing world and underdeveloped world. And countries like Korea, where I'm from, when I was working in the ministry, most of my colleagues in the high level of decision-making, the activities are males, in fact. And naturally, we put our own bias without knowing the very specific travel patterns of women. And when we design infrastructure and when we introduce a new service for the society, and basically we cannot really know what women needs, especially specifically. So first of all, I think we have to empower women to make them participate more actively in the decision-making procedure, especially on a higher level. And also when we have to design infrastructure and conceptualize it in the future, it should reflect more flexibility and perhaps more universal the aspect to accommodate all the different, the social weak, I would say, this disabled, not only women, but also disabled people and children and so on and so on.
So in a way that's true anytime, and hopefully that's something you thrive, we all thrive to do. But can you bring it in the context of climate change, and how does that exacerbate maybe the issues that women face in terms of access? How does that impact women in terms of, when there's an extreme weather event, as well, they're probably impairing their mobility. Can you just bring that in the context of climate change and the urgency to consider that?
Okay, let's look at a simple example. So we have a public transport system. Okay, everyone thinks that it's nice and it can be an alternative to prevent people from using their private car. But in reality, men use more cars than women in many countries. And how can we make women use more public transport safely and conveniently? And I think it definitely should reflect the climate change factors in the public transport system and also infrastructure in general. So if we cannot make our public transport network safer and more convenient and more eco-friendly, basically we cannot really make all the people use, including women, more actively our transport the system.
And what about then the part that women play as, again, I'm always trying to get to women's ability to come up with unique solutions to climate change through a transport lens. What does that look like?
I think basically the climate question doesn't discriminate men and women because half of the citizens in any society are women. But basically women are in a more difficult situation when it comes to the utilization of the public transport or even the climate change related mobility services. But these days, the questions in the mobility sector are becoming more and more complicated. So we have digital development and also climate change questions coming up. And basically, now we can use our platforms with the cell phone and so on. So basically, how can we make women contribute more to the decarbonizing society? And then I think we can try to combine different factors.
Thank you. I mean, Farhana, I turn to you maybe then. What are sort of radical ideas that you have on how we need to mainstream a much more joined-up approach between climate action, gender equality, and just climate action and gender equality? And, coming back from COP27, what are your perspectives on that?
I think, first and foremost, women are half the solutions that we need every time we exclude, diminish, marginalize, or disenfranchise groups, we are diminishing the set of solutions that can be taken forward and their buy-in and uptake. So I think more and more I see less and less greenhouse gases per capita as the right metric that we should focus on, and we should focus on solutions per capita. Everyone is a solution provider, women especially so. And just on this issue of where does the more radical ideas, where does this real decarbonized, nature respecting, rights respecting world, what does it really look and feel like? I think in some ways COVID gave us a taste of how we could work very differently and what home, family, community life could really look like. And overnight we had demands that women had been making for decades for flexible working and working from home that happened overnight. And once men found that commuting wasn't such a great thing after all, you know, great swathes of workforces, work people have given up the right to commute. And that has massive implications for the way in which we organize society to be more local, to be more community-based, to have ideas like a 15-minute city. Obviously, the infrastructure of cities, the infrastructure of industrialization exists, and we're going to have to navigate our way around it. But I think some of the most exciting ideas are coming forward from that experience that we had in lockdown, in particular, from communities being able to design, create, change at the street level, at the village level, at the high street level. I'm looking at a number of streets. My own street here is full of cars that do not leave their parking spaces except one day a week. So it's a massive waste of resources to focus just on car use. You had also experiments being done where people are being given in Germany, Spain, France, I think, you know, free access to public transport to get people back into the idea of using public transport for leisure, for pleasure, for reacquainting ourselves with it. You had experiments where young people were given free transport or subsidized transport in many countries, because transport essentially means mobility to go and find jobs, to go to colleges, to go out and to socialize, to be part of community activities. And young people are often completely priced out of public transport and are priced out of cars. So I think there are a lot of radical solutions about how we live that are coming forward from our young people, from women in particular, who want a different kind of society rather than the society that was constructed essentially around the needs of industrialization, where essentially a basically male workforce left to go and work in factories or offices, and then the women tried to catch up with that or played a very different role in the workforce. So I think we're at that point where we can completely redesign and shift things. And I think one of the things that COP27 did do was a lot more discussions around these visions, about a positive set of choices and visions about how we take things forward. So some of the disappointments in terms of where we are in terms of global emissions and the lack of financing and funding, which are lamentable. But I think the positive things that happened was a huge number of movements, of social groups, of entrepreneurs, of visionaries connecting and discussing the real world that we want to live in and how we're going to get there. So that for me was a very positive part of COP27.
Thank you, Farhana. And yesterday, Maria Rinson said, you know, climate change is a problem that's been caused by men that needs a feminine solution. So the question is, where does the leadership for this kind of solutions, localized, more community-based solution will come from? And Florence, I wonder from your point of view, I think you've been placing a lot of emphasis at Zurich in creating the right condition and leadership context for women to be leading and thinking about these issues and those solutions. Can you talk a little bit about what are you putting in place for that leadership from women?
Well, maybe before talking about Zurich, I think there is a quick win, an urgent action, which is about increasing the representation of women in decision-making bodies. Why is that? Back in Rio, the Earth Summit, the point of women representation into those issues was raised. Since then, each and every COP, and that's now 30 years, we have been pointing out to that element. Again, in the Paris Agreement in 2015, in the preamble statement, it was mentioned the importance of having women being represented in those discussions. Yet, the reality today is what? And you're coming obviously from the COP. In the COP delegation this year, only 33% representation of women, very little in being in a decision-making capacity. And in a report that was published earlier this year from the WEF, it is mentioned that to close that gap, it would take us another 132 years, that is 6th generation. So I think this is a sort of quick wins. It's much more difficult, much more complex, much more long-term to have women being part of designing the solutions, which we have discussed. But this one is, for me, a low-hanging fruit. Then to your question about...
Can I just say on that point, She Changes Climate, which is a partner of the Women's Forum, has been actually militating for a joint presidency of the COP28 with a man and a woman, which makes so much sense in many ways. I don't know if they'll succeed, but we are certainly supporting them. To your second point then.
Yeah, so what Zurich does as an insurer, and obviously, the topic of, diversity and inclusion is an important topic for us, but I won't expand on that. I think as an insurer, we have three kind of roles into society. One is around investing. So we are the first investors globally into economies, into society. And here, the main challenge when it comes to climate is to making sure that we direct those investments to the right innovation. And today, that's the first struggle. Are we to a point where those investment processes are not biased with other factors, especially the gender factor? That's not the case today, and that's probably something we'll need to work on. Then the second aspect is that we are risk underwriters. And today we are starting to, in the multiple crises we are living through, to understand the fact that there are multiple factors which do correlate with themselves, but it's very difficult at this point in time to predict climate change, as it is to predict other type of risks, because we are faced at a current point where the magnitude, the frequency, and the nature of the risk is evolving tremendously. The third aspect is that we believe that the key answer to all of that is about resilience. It's about helping individuals and corporates work on prevention and transition solution. And this is probably where we are the most advanced in terms of taking that gender element. But to achieve all of that, it starts with one thing. And if there is one message which I think I would like to pass on to all of you today, is that we need data. We absolutely need data to understand the adverse exposure that women have to certain risks, climate change in particular. We need data to understand the efficiency of solution, and we need to have data to understand the benefits of those solutions and how it relates to gender.
So would you say, Florence, that it is now a priority for Zurich to start overlaying that gender lens and climate justice lens on how you develop products, insurance products?
That's probably the next step. Yes, indeed. It's to understand the correlation between various types of risk. Are we there yet? No, but that there is a beginning.
But am I right to say that there is understanding the risk, but also the opportunities to actually create the condition for, say, women entrepreneurs, women at the front line, to be part of the solution through insurance products?
Yes, indeed. And probably, again, the area where we are most advanced in terms of providing product and services is when it comes to addressing resilience and finding resilience solution.
Great. And I know data is a big issue, but we really see insurance companies really starting to look at this opportunity as well. Wangte, if I go back to you, then you recently launched that gender analysis toolkit for transport policies and a report on gender equality on the role of women in decarbonizing transport. congratulations, first of all. Maybe if you can share one or two key findings from that research to the audience that could inform that discussion.
I think it's a bit difficult to describe so many things in a word, but basically...
you have 1 minute.
that's a great challenge.
Yes.
But you know, already in the mobility sector, as I mentioned, we have a lot of discussions on digitalization, climate change, and connectivity, and so on and so on. Gender issue, most recently. Then we try to combine with the matrices that we have. But as I mentioned, in the mobility sector, still a lot of decision makers are males, and all the infrastructure and services are biased a bit toward male. So in ITF, what we are doing is that we try to give some evidence, so analytic information about difference of travel patterns between men and women.
Okay. So you're providing this data that Florence is after in some ways.
Happy to collaborate, but at the same time, we recently launched, as you mentioned, a gender analysis toolkit for transport. Basically, this is a guideline of a checkup list for policymakers.
And that's global, for a global audience?
Yes, yes. And also we apply this internally in ITF as well.
Right.
So this is kind of objective guidelines for policymakers so that gender factors can be more reflected and taken into consideration when they implement policies. So ITF with member countries having all the different situations, so it's not easy to say this is right, this is wrong, but we try to provide a lot of options so that they can choose and combine, and if they find some best practices, they can share. So all these the research outcomes are freely downloadable from our website, so in the PDF format. So we produce more than 60 publications every year. So all of you can visit our website and
Great.
You can get more.
Visit their website
yes.
For further insights. So I just realized that time is running out, and obviously this is a big, heavy, complex topic. So I'm just thinking, what do we need more of in order to mainstream climate justice, gender justice? Florence, you mentioned data. Farhana, is there enough focus on that? Is there enough funding behind that? What do you think we need more of to really accelerate? And now that I think the evidence of the link between climate justice and our ability to thrive and bend the curve on decarbonization.
Well, I currently work in philanthropy, and sadly, global philanthropy on climate is a very, very small part of overall philanthropy, less than 2%, maybe 3% as a result, 3%. But most of that goes to organizations led by men, about 80%, according to one study, and more than 90% of it goes to organizations led by white people. So we're leaving out huge swathes of people. We may think we're living in an equal society, and maybe at an event like this today, I wish I was there in person, we feel empowered and encouraged, and there are genuine signs of progress and opportunity. But systemically, it's really not the case that we are anywhere near the point of equality in any sector. And I think that in the sector that I'm working in, we really need to work much, much harder to very quickly dismantle these barriers, to become aware of these barriers, how large they are, and to start shifting serious amounts of resources to those who are on the front lines, to those who are historically or currently marginalized as a result of these systemic biases and prejudices, frankly, that come from centuries ago, but are still very much alive and with us. And I think that reinforcing the point that Yongtae and Florence have made, very eloquently, you have to change who's sitting at the table of decision making. And so actually making sure that representation is equal at each and every level, including the very highest level, is very, very important. And we're, in some cases, going backwards on that. Yeah. And when, we have very important positions of posts like the COP presidency, actually it went from an environment minister who was a woman to a foreign minister who was a man. And that's the dynamic that we've had in the COPs. that suddenly they become so important. The women leaders who exist are pushed out.
Yeah.
This has happened at 2 or 3 COPs, by the way. The women environment ministers are the ones who got the COP in the first place, and then they were given a secondary role. And so I totally support campaigns like She Changes Climate, as well as other gender equality campaigns, to really press forward and keep very vigilant and ask for more and more and more in terms of power and decision making.
Thank you, Farhana. And we can really be a voice, I think, in constant pressure on that lack of representation or shifting roles. What you were saying there was really important. I think we need more finance, but that finance needs to go to the right people. And in COP, there is a lot of talk. It needs to go to the indigenous people that have so much wisdom and knowledge to bring out. So Florence and Yongtae, I'll finish with you. You know, what, in your view, we need more of to mainstream climate justice? And we literally have 30 seconds each.
So if I would conclude just with one sentence, is that we won't achieve climate justice without the transparency, without the justice of data.
Interesting. And that's pressure on corporates to report on that as well. So thank you for this suggestion. And Yongtae, from your point of view?
Not even a one sentence, maybe one word, and I would like to put diversity. So diversity meaning inclusiveness and respect for others. And basically in every society, we are strongly stuck in our own dogma and biased situations. But when we talk about gender, also climate changes, basically we have to try to enhance diversity. And diversity can bring a lot of solutions.
Wonderful. And obviously the risk is we are on the Women's Forum, has been for the last 18 years on that fight for greater diversity, but climate change has the potential of derailing progress we have made over the last 20 years. So it's not only more diversity, but preventing it to be derailed by climate change. So with this, I'm going to liberate you to have lunch, and I'm here, there is plenty of it today, so you don't even have to rush to get for it. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm prematurely sending you to lunch. I'm so sorry. I must be hungry. But please join me of thanking our speakers.
Don't go anywhere.
Please join me in thanking our speakers then for this great conversation.
Bravo, bravo. Sophie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Farhana, as well.
Thank you to our wonderful panel. Don't go anywhere.
Sorry. Thank
Just
you.
for 2 minutes. Bravo, Sophie, thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful panel. The impact of unpaid care. Thank you so much.